There is a moment in every conflict where the question stops being what happened and becomes who was allowed to define what happened. This is the moment where resistance turns into crime, or, just as often, where crime is retroactively renamed resistance. That line is not moral. It is not legal in any neutral sense. It is political, and it is enforced by whoever survives long enough to write the record. Every revolutionary is a criminal until they win. Every state calls its violence security.
Casualties have been very, very encouraging. The operation appears to have gone very well.
Every challenger is labeled terrorist, bandit, insurgent, or criminal until power changes hands, or until it doesn't. This is not a cynical slogan. It is a pattern you can trace across centuries, continents, and ideologies. The core issue is not whether violence is good or bad. States commit violence constantly while insisting they are preventing it. The real issue is legitimacy. Who has the authority to use force, and who has the authority to name that force after the fact? No society objects to violence in general. Societies object to unauthorized violence. Police violence is called law enforcement. Military violence is called defense. Economic violence is called policy. The same physical act, killing, imprisonment, destruction, changes meaning depending on the badge, uniform, or flag attached to it. This is why legality is a poor guide to morality in moments of conflict. Law is not a referee hovering above history. Law is written by institutions that already possesses force. That state does not outlaw violence because it is immoral. It monopolizes violence because monopoly is how states exist. Once you understand this, the resistance/crime distinction stops being mysterious. It becomes a procedure. The American Revolution is often taught as a clean moral rupture, liberty versus tyranny, freedom versus empire. What gets quietly skipped is that under British law, every major figure of the revolution was committing high treason. George Washington was not a general in 1776. He was a rebel officer commanding an illegal militia. The Declaration of Independence was not a founding document, it was a confession. The signers were explicitly aware that, if Britain won, they would be executed. The British government did not view the revolutionaries as freedom fighters. It viewed them as criminals destabilizing imperial order. British officials used the language of law, not cruelty. Rebellion, sedition, unlawful assemblies, sound familiar? It should.
January the 25th, 2011, the Arab Spring spreads to Egypt with a day of rage.
Nothing about the revolutionaries' actions changed between 1775 and 1783. Only the outcome did. The same men went from traitors to founding fathers because they won. Victory laundered illegality into legitimacy. This is not a criticism of the American Revolution. It is a clarification. If you celebrate it, and I do, you are already accepting that law does not define justice during conflict. Power does. Colonial regimes perfected the art of criminalizing resistance, not because resistance was uniquely violent, but because criminal law was more useful than war rhetoric. In India, British authorities labeled independence activists as criminals and terrorists, even when they were nonviolent. In Algeria, the French treated the FLN not as a political movement, but as criminal gangs. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising was framed as savage criminality rather than organized rebellion against land seizure and racial rule. This framing did important work. Criminals don't negotiate.
Stop the terror. I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Criminals don't have grievances. Criminals don't represent populations. Criminals are simply removed. Colonial law made resistance illegal by definition. That didn't make the resistance immoral, it made the law a weapon. And here's the uncomfortable truth many post-colonial states don't like to admit. Once independence was achieved, many of these movements adopted the same logic. Former revolutionaries criminalized dissent using the very legal structure they once resisted. Legitimacy did not end violence, it reorganized it. There is a convenient myth that the US civil rights movement succeeded because it was peaceful and therefore legitimate. This is ahistorical. Peaceful protest was illegal across the Jim Crow South. Marching without permits, sitting at lunch counters, boycotting businesses, these were all crimes. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested dozens of times. The FBI considered him a subversive threat. The state did not suddenly recognize moral clarity. It reacted to sustained disruption it can no longer suppress without exposing its own brutality. Even non-violence had to be criminalized before it could be tolerated. This matters because it destroys the fantasy that legitimacy precedes resistance. It doesn't. Legitimacy follows pressure, and pressure, almost by definition, violates existing rules. Nowhere is the resistance/crime distinction more aggressively policed than in Palestine. From the Israeli state's perspective, virtually all Palestinian armed resistance is terrorism by definition.
I think it's indicative of the enemy we're dealing with. These people are monsters.
This is not because of tactics alone, but because acknowledging resistance would require acknowledging occupation, dispossession, and political agency. Terrorism language removes all three. From many Palestinians' perspective, resistance, armed or otherwise, is framed as a response to structural violence, military occupation, land confiscation, checkpoints, arrests, blockades. When law itself is an instrument of domination, violating that law does not feel like criminality. It feels like survival. Here's where my analysis becomes sharp and uncomfortable, and I won't soften it. You can recognize Palestinian resistance as politically intelligible without romanticizing it. You can condemn attacks on civilians without denying the reality of occupation. You can reject terrorism without pretending the state's violence is somehow clean or apolitical. What poisons this discussion is moral asymmetry masquerading as principle. Israeli state violence is framed as a regrettable necessity.
When the most savage terrorists on earth are effusively praising your decision, you didn't do something right. You did something wrong, horribly wrong.
Palestinian violence is framed as inherent barbarism.
You just realize the terrible, dreadful, inhuman people, frankly, that we are dealing with.
This is not analysis. It's a narrative enforcement. The question isn't, is Palestinian violence legitimate in the abstract? That's too easy. The real question is, why is Israeli violence assumed legitimate before it is examined?
This is about Israel and Israel's right to defend itself and our strong support for Israel's right to defend itself.
While Palestinian violence is assumed illegitimate before it is understood.
Be tougher than Chris Christie, okay?
The Palestinians are not a real estate deal, Donald.
Okay, no. A deal,
They're not a real estate deal.
Is a deal. Let me tell you,
a deal is not a deal when you're dealing with terrorists. Have you ever negotiated with terrorists?
You are not a negotiator.
That assumption does not come from ethics. It comes from power. Terrorism is one of the most effective political words ever invented because it collapses motive, method, and morality into a single accusation. Once applied, discussion ends. Insurgencies in Iraq, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Kashmir, pick your geography, are almost always described through this lens. The term does not ask what conditions produce resistance, it asks whether resistance violates an existing order. But existing orders are not neutral. Many are the product of invasion, partition, or authoritarian consolidation. Calling resistance terrorism does not make those histories disappear. It just makes them irrelevant. This doesn't mean insurgent violence is justified. Many insurgent groups commit atrocities. So do states. The difference is that states get to call their atrocities mistakes, while insurgents get called monsters.
As far as the incident last week, we have received a formal apology from Foreign Minister Goran Svilanovic.
That distinction is not moral, it is institutional. Violence against civilians is indefensible, regardless of who commits it. Not because law says so, but because it destroys the very claim to justice that resistance relies on. You cannot build liberation on the deliberate targeting of non-combatants without hollowing it out. At the same time, I reject the idea that state violence is morally privileged simply because it's legal. Legality is not innocence. Occupation does not become humane because it is regulated. Bombing does not become ethical because it is procedural. Resistance becomes crime at the point where power successfully convinces the world that its own violence is invisible. That point shifts constantly and moves with borders, media, institutions, and memory. Today's terrorist is tomorrow's statesman. Today's security operation is tomorrow's war crime inquiry, if the power balance ever changes. The real question is not who is right, it is who gets to decide. Who writes the laws during conflict? Who controls the courts? Who controls the language? Justice is not absent from these struggles. It is buried under authority. And until we are honest about that, we will keep pretending that violence is a moral anomaly rather than the currency through which political order is enforced. Resistance doesn't become crime because it crosses a moral line. It becomes crime because it threatens a monopoly. That is the point where history always turns.